Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events as seen through the lens of American history, as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. Today's episode is focused on the tariff battles of the 19th century. For the last 100 years or so, it's the income tax that has been the principal source of revenue for the United States, but for the century before that, it was the tariff, a tax on imported goods that provided the federal government with the vast majority of its funds. It was also incredibly controversial throughout the 19th century. In fact, probably the second most controversial topic domestically in the United States next to slavery. And like slavery, it was a sectional issue. You had the North and the East with one perspective, the South and the West with a different perspective. And here's where it broke down. The folks in the North and the East, this was more about manufacturing and finished goods producers. They wanted a high tariff, not necessarily to bring in more revenue to the federal government, but as protection. They were called protective tariffs to protect them from inexpensive goods coming in from abroad. You raise that price with a high tariff and makes their finished goods more attractive to domestic buyers. They favored high protective tariffs. But in the South and the West, where they focused more on raw materials and agricultural products, perhaps with the opportunity to export them to other buyers, they wanted a low tariff, just enough to fund the federal government, but no more. Why? Because if the United States puts a protective tariff on, other countries would retaliate. They would put a tariff on the American goods that are being produced and trying to be sold abroad, and so they would have less ability to actually sell those products. So it divided very much along regional lines about where you stood, and again, very controversial. Let's get into the different instances of where this really cropped up, and we'll start in the 1820s. John Quincy Adams is President of the United States. Henry Clay is his Secretary of State. Clay, as an emerging leader of the Whig Party, had put forward what he called his American system. And this talked about federally funded internal improvements being use of federal funds, also a national bank, and a high protective tariff. They wanted to keep those finished goods out and give domestic producers better chance to sell to domestic consumers. So in 1828, the last year of the Adams administration, Congress passed the highest tariff to date in American history, and the South basically erupted. They called it the Tariff of Abominations. And in fact, the leading opponent of this tariff was Adams' own vice president, John Calhoun from South Carolina, who came out with what he called the South Carolina Exposition. They said this is not only wrong, it's unconstitutional, you can't have a tariff other than just for the revenue that you need. And in fact, we as a state in South Carolina can nullify that law if we want to. Well, the arguments persisted into the Andrew Jackson administration, where, interestingly enough, Calhoun is vice president again, this time to Jackson. And in 1832, things are really coming to a head about that old Tariff of Abominations, where again, South Carolina is threatened to nullify that law, make it null and void within the borders of South Carolina. Well, in April the 13th in Washington, D.C., at the Indian Queen Hotel, it's a Jefferson Day dinner. Toasts are being made. The president is there, the vice president, many of the cabinet, and Andrew Jackson stands up first and boldly proclaims 6 words. Our union, it must be preserved. We're not going to talk about this nullification stuff, and he put that right on the table. Well, as Vice President John Calhoun stood up and countered it immediately with his toast. The union next to our liberty most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and by distributing equally the benefit and the burden of the Union. They were very much at odds, and this continued because within a few months, South Carolina actually passed ordinances of nullification. The tariff come next year is going to be null and void. We're not going to collect it here in the state of South Carolina. Well, Andrew Jackson wasn't going to let this happen. He was actually more of a states' rights kind of guy, but not when it came to things like nullification or potentially secession, which was actually implied by some of the statements coming out of South Carolina. He said, that's not going to happen on my watch. He issued his nullification proclamation, which said, I consider then the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle upon which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed. He was going to pursue what was called a force bill, legal authority to go into South Carolina and enforce that law, forgetting this whole nullification bid by the state of South Carolina. This is a constitutional crisis, really one of the first major constitutional crises that the Americans had faced, and fortunately, a compromise came in and put the issue to bed. Henry Clay is now back in the Senate, And he was working behind the scenes to bring down the tariff, a compromise tariff that would slowly bring down those rates. Everybody could save face. It passed. The crisis was averted. But this tariff issue almost brought the country to its knees with a secession argument and nullification here in the 1830s, and this issue would again crop up later and later during this century. Let's move forward. From Old Hickory to Young Hickory, Andrew Jackson to James Polk. We're now in 1844. Polk is running for office as president. He wins that election, and he's got four major pieces of agenda items that he wants to accomplish. He wants to solve border disputes in Texas and in Oregon. He wants to expand the country through the notion of manifest destiny all the way to California. He wants to create a sub-treasury in the federal government, and he wants to resolve the tariff conflict, which continued to go back and forth between these sections of the country, creating a lot of divides in the United States. Well, when he was running for election, people wanted to know, where do you stand, Mr. Polk, on this issue of the tariff? And he wisely basically was ambiguous in his response. He knew how controversial this is. You didn't want to alienate anyone, but he felt he had to answer, particularly the people in Pennsylvania. Manufacturing Center, a lot of votes in the Electoral College. He needed them to maybe stand down any opposition, and so what he did was he wrote a letter. It's called the Kane Letter, but it was a public letter that used the word protection not once but twice. But again, the meaning was ambiguous. He really wasn't giving his cards away, leaving his options open. So it appeased enough people in Pennsylvania. He gets their vote. He wins the presidency. But as soon as he gets in, he makes it clear he is not in favor of a high tariff. He wants to bring tariff rates down. And in fact, he also wants to introduce an innovation into the process, an ad valorem tariff. What did that mean? They're going to calculate tariffs based on a percent rather than an actual hard dollar number, and so it can fluctuate a little bit as prices go up and down. He thought this would create greater stability. He pursues this and says that it would actually be something that could be lasting for the United States to solve this problem for good. According to Polk, such a system would be permanent, not subject to the constant complaints, agitations, and changes which must ever occur when duties are not laid for revenue but for the protection merely of a favored interest. Well, it passed easily in the House. In the Senate, it's going to be close, passed by one vote, 28 to 27. Rates on the tariff came down, and they adopted the ad valorem process, and we had tariff peace for the next 3 or 4 decades. Things got to be pretty stable. Well, we come now to the last 20 years of the 19th century, the Golden Age, or the Gilded Age in American history, and there was a new president who had just taken over, Chester Arthur. It's 1881. James Garfield's been assassinated. Arthur's the president, and one of the things he realizes, there's a lot of money sitting in the Treasury vault. They've got about $100 million of excess funds. And he says, this isn't good for the country. It's idle money. It's not doing anybody any good. And so what did he want to do? He wanted to lower taxes, internal taxes, and he wanted to reduce the tariff. Well, again, controversy arose between the different sections of the country. There was a lot of proposals that he put on the table. It did not get through Congress, but they at least authorized a commission to study it. The issue was very much back in play for the next presidential election when things on the tariff really heat up again. Grover Cleveland is elected in 1884, becomes president in 1885, and he is a reformer. And he doesn't think this is any good, again, to have all this money sitting in the federal treasury, and so he does something that no president had ever done before. He devoted his entire annual message, what we now call the State of the Union address. In 1887, the entire thing was on one topic, and that topic was the tariff, and he wanted tariff rates to come down. According to Cleveland, the public treasury, which should only exist as a conduit conveying the people's tribute to its legitimate objects of expenditure, becomes a hoarding place for money needlessly withdrawn from trade and the people's use, thus crippling our national energy, suspending our country's development, preventing investment in productive enterprise, threatening financial disturbance, and inviting schemes of public plunder. Having all this money sit in the treasury vaults doesn't do anybody any good. Let's lower the tariff, get to a revenue-only stand. Let's expand the free list, so actually things like sugar and coffee and clothing, what they call necessities, there shouldn't be any tariff on those at all. Well, again, this is a tough sell in Congress. They negotiated through the House. They got some reductions. It died in the Senate. Did not get the tariff that he wanted, but he made it a campaign issue that again continued to persist in 1888. Introducing now into the equation is Benjamin Harrison, a Civil War hero, the former senator from Indiana who happens to be the grandson of the 9th President of the United States, William Henry Harrison, and Benjamin Harrison is staunchly pro-tariff. He goes into the campaign, a front porch campaign, saying this is all about. This is about American jobs. That's what protective tariffs are about. According to Harrison, if someone says that labor is not fully employed now, do you hope it will become more fully employed when you have transferred 1/3 of the work done in our shops to foreign workshops? If someone tells me that labor is not sufficiently rewarded here, does he hope to have its rewards increased by striking down our protective duties and compelling our workmen to compete with the underpaid labor of Europe? Well, he had an answer for that. No, it would not. We need to raise that tariff, protect jobs in the United States. So again, you have these competing interests both sectionally and almost philosophically about what to do with the tariff to drive policies about, again, protective tariffs or revenue-only tariffs. Well, Harrison had a lot of support from a couple of powerful organizations like the Protective Tariff League and the Iron and Steel Association. A lot of money behind his campaign. He wins the White House, and target number one on his watch for his agenda, bring that tariff down. And for this, he had a partner in Congress. The chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which would write this legislation, was a congressman from Ohio by the name of William McKinley. McKinley had been pushing high tariffs since he joined the House in 1877, and like Harrison, he saw this as part of an America First agenda. It was about American jobs. According to McKinley, he said that the foreign producer has no right or claim to equality with our own. He is not amenable to our laws. There are resting upon him none of the obligations of citizenship. He pays no taxes. He performs no civil duties. We put a burden upon his products. We discriminate against his merchandise because he is alien to us and our interests, and we do it to protect, defend, and preserve our own. He went on to say this bill is an American bill. It is made for the American people and American interests. Core principles were at stake, very much an America First agenda. It went through, it became the McKinley Tariff is what it was called, and also passed in this. There were some other provisions about the ability for the president to negotiate bilateral reciprocity agreements. So if you can negotiate with another country, both sides to eliminate tariffs, that was possible now. And so there were other provisions in here, but the principal thing was tariff rates went up from 38% to almost 50%. The average was 49.5% on goods coming into the United States. Harrison's happy, he signs it into law, but the American people are not happy. In the midterms, the Republicans of Harrison and McKinley were pounded. They lost half their seats in the House, including McKinley. He was voted out of office. Within 2 years, Grover Cleveland is back in the White House and once again ready to resume that fight about the tariff to try to bring the rates that just went way up, bring them back down. In his inaugural address, Cleveland said it perverts the patriotic sentiments of our countrymen, tempts them to pitiful calculation of the sordid gain to be derived from their government's maintenance by having these high tariffs. It undermines the self-reliance of our people, substitutes in its place dependence upon governmental favoritism. It stifles the spirit of true Americanism, stupefies every ennobling trait of American citizenship. So again, these completely counter views on what to do about the tariff. Well, in this case, a tariff did go through. It was called the Wilson-Gorman Tariff. It brought tariff rates down, but frankly, only a little. Cleveland was not terribly happy with the legislation. He wanted to come down a lot more. He allowed it to come into law even without his signature. It just came into law because he didn't veto it, but he wasn't terribly happy with it, but rates came down just a little bit. The final stage on the 19th century tariff battles is when William McKinley takes over for Cleveland as the final president of the United States of the century, elected in 1896. His core issue? Protection. He wants the tariff rates to go back up again. The ping pong ball keeps moving. Reversing the Wilson-Gorman Tariff was something called the Dingley Tariff, which actually exceeded the rates of the McKinley Tariff that had passed a few years before, once again trying to provide protection for those American industries. But what was interesting about this, things were changing. American exporters had not done a lot of business actually throughout the 19th century. It was still a small part of the American economy, but it was really picking up toward the latter part of the 19th century, and McKinley was aware of this. So after he's reelected, he goes to Buffalo, New York to give a speech on the economy. It would turn out to be the last speech speech of his life. And he did it with a major about face, a pivot to free trade, reciprocity agreements, and not having all that protection. In this speech in Buffalo, McKinley said the day of exclusiveness was past. Protective tariffs and commercial wars no longer serve their purpose. Reciprocity agreements and sensible trade agreements should take the place of retaliatory measures. They'd open up new channels for America's expanding surplus products. A big about face from McKinley, but that's because the country was changing. Not as much of still an importer of goods, but also more of an exporter. For America First, those exporters also had a seat at the table. And so if we can have reciprocity agreements, maybe that would be better for everyone. That's what he put on the table. He would not live to see it come to fruition. He was assassinated the very next day in Buffalo. In another decade, the 16th Amendment would pass to the Constitution, authorizing the income tax. By the time we get to the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, principally funded by raising taxes through the income tax process. The tariff of the 20th century certainly didn't go away. Tariffs were still prominent in parts and of the economic model for the United States, but much less prominent, much less controversial than it was in the 19th century, primarily because the funding of the government fundamentally shifted away from the tariff to be much more focused on the income tax. It's never been as controversial or as prominent was in the 19th century, maybe until now. But those are stories for another day, and that is a look at the tariff battles of the 19th century. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.